My name is Elinor Kincaid, but everybody called me Nell. I'm 56 years old, and 3 days ago I drove from Lewisburg, West Virginia to Pittsburgh to see whether I could give my mother a kidney after spending most of my life as the daughter she mentioned only after she was done talking about my sister. Adrian is a cardiologist in Charlotte. In my mother's version of the family, she was always the daughter with the white coat, the framed photographs, and the life worth describing in detail. I was the other one, the one from the post office, the one who always had time. When my mother's kidneys began to fail, the hospital called me before she did my mother. My mother never called me first for love, only for logistics. I got tested, I was a strong match, and in the transplant evaluation room, when she tried one more time to talk around me instead of to me, I asked her a question so simple it left the whole room silent. Let me take you back to the morning Pittsburgh called. 3 mornings earlier, I had been standing in the back room of the Lewisburg post office, sorting a tray of flats for Greenbrier County, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it. We were short-handed that day, and my route was already running heavy. But the number was from Pennsylvania, and something in me said, answer it. A woman named Naomi Keller introduced herself from UPMC Presbyterian. Her voice was calm, professional, practiced in the way people sound when they know they are stepping into a family's worst day. She confirmed my full name, confirmed that Dorothy Kincaid was my mother, then told me my mother had been admitted after a severe decline in kidney function and had listed me as a family contact. She did not say much more than that at first. She did not need to. I leaned against a gray metal sorting case while letters slid out of my hand and back into the tray. My mother had not called me in months without a reason. Now she was in Pittsburgh, and the first voice I heard was a transplant coordinator asking if I was her daughter. Yes, I said. There was a pause on the line. Then Naomi said thank you, in that careful hospital tone. She explained that the transplant team was contacting immediate family members as part of an early evaluation process, and that if I was willing, someone would follow up with next steps. She asked if I had any questions. I had too many. None of them sounded fit for a fluorescent sorting room at 8:17 in the morning. I said I understood. She said someone would be in touch soon. Then the line went dead, and I stood there with a tub of mail at my feet and the kind of cold that does not come from weather. Adrian called before I made it back to my route truck. Her voice was clipped and controlled, the same voice she used when she wanted to sound compassionate without ever risking softness. Mom had a bad episode. They moved her to Pittsburgh because Charleston wasn't equipped for what she needs right now. They're evaluating her for a possible living donor if she stabilizes. I shut the truck door and looked out across the employee lot. A flag snapped in the wind behind the building. Someone in maintenance was dragging a broken pallet toward the dumpster. Have you been tested? I asked. Not yet. Not yet? She exhaled like I was being difficult. My schedule is impossible this week. I've got procedures stacked back to back, and the team is still going through options. We don't even know if she'll qualify for transplant yet. I let that sit there. Adrian filled silence the way other people filled their gas tanks, efficiently, and only as much as necessary. Nell, this is serious. We need to stay focused and not make it emotional. Not make it emotional. Our mother was in kidney failure, and my sister's greatest fear seemed to be that someone might mention the family history she had spent decades floating above. I went out on my route anyway. Rural roads do not care that your mother is sick or that your sister has already started building herself an exit. Mail still has to go out. Mrs. Bell still needs her prescriptions. Mr. Harlan still waits by the same blue box on Caldwell Lane because he likes to wave before I pull away. That was the thing about my life. People counted on me. Not because I was brilliant or glamorous or impressive at dinner parties, because I showed up every day. In rain, in August heat, in sleet that turned the hills to glass. I knew which houses had dogs that barked and which ones had widowers who would talk your ear off if you let them. I knew where to leave a package if someone's porch roof leaked. I knew who had lost a husband, who had a grandbaby, who would be late paying the electric bill but always paid eventually. Out there, people called me Nell. At my mother's house, I was whatever fit around Adrian. The last Thanksgiving made that clear in a way even I could not keep explaining away. Dorothy had opened the front door before the pies were cool and started performing family for the neighbors who came over after church. "This is Adrian," she had said, with that bright, proud smile she saved for public use. "My daughter, the heart doctor in Charlotte." Then her hand floated toward me, standing there with gravy on my sleeve because I had been in the kitchen helping plate the food. "And this is my other daughter. She works for the post office." Nobody corrected her. Nobody even looked surprised. My cousin stared into his sweet potatoes. One of the neighbors smiled politely, the way people do when they sense something awkward and decide it belongs to someone else. Later, while I was rinsing dishes, I stood in Dorothy's living room and counted. Dorothy at medical school graduation, Dorothy at her white coat ceremony, Dorothy at her wedding day with her husband, Dorothy and her children in matching Christmas pajamas, Dorothy speaking at some conference podium with a microphone pinned to her blouse. Not one photo of me. Not my root truck, not my retirement banquet from last spring, not my face at all. When I got home from work that day, my kitchen was dark because I had walked in and forgotten to turn on the light. Cal Mercer knocked 10 minutes later and came in holding a stainless steel thermos and 2 mugs. He looked at the papers on my table, then at my shirt still tucked into my work pants. "You planning to save her, or are you trying to live with yourself after?" he asked. Cal never wasted words. He had buried a wife, retired from the city utility department, and developed the sort of honesty that only older men with nothing left to prove ever seemed to master. I poured the coffee he brought and stared at the steam. "I don't know yet," I said. That was true for about 6 more hours. The clinic linked to UPMC got me in the next morning for preliminary blood work. The nurse explained everything plainly. Initial screening, basic labs, blood type, compatibility markers. No commitment implied. You can stop at any point. This only moves forward if you want it to. I nodded through all of it, but the sentence that stayed with me was simpler than the medical terms. If you want it to. No one in my family had asked that. Not my mother, not Adrian, not even me, if I was being honest. Naomi called that afternoon while I was sitting in my truck outside the post office, keys in the ignition, engine off. She told me my first round came back strong enough to move me quickly into a full donor workup in Pittsburgh. Imaging, labs, consults, psychosocial evaluation, independent donor advocate. She kept her tone level, but what she was really saying was this. If I drove north in the morning, I would not just be stepping into a hospital process, I would be stepping into the first room in my life where my mother might be required to tell the truth about me. I went home, took off my USPS badge, and set it beside my keys on the kitchen counter. Cal was leaning against the doorway with his mug in one hand. He did not ask what the answer was. He saw it on my face. "I'm driving up tomorrow," I said. Not because anything had been forgiven, not because my mother had suddenly become someone else, just because if something in this family was finally going to change, it had to begin in a place where everything was written down, witnessed, and impossible to smooth over with a smile. I was back at the post office before sunrise, trading shifts with a carrier named Melissa and leaving route notes on a clipboard that still had rain spots from Monday. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A rolling hamper squealed across the concrete floor. Everything around me was ordinary in the way work always is, even when your life has tilted sideways. Judah Keene found me at my case with a stack of forwarded mail in his arms. "How many days you need?" I kept sorting while I thought. "At least 2, maybe 3 if they keep me up there for testing." He nodded once. "We'll cover it. Don't argue with me, Nell. Half these folks only get their bills on time because you scare the rest of us into reading street numbers properly." That got the smallest breath of a laugh out of me. "I'll bring the truck back full and clean," I said. You always do. He walked off before I could thank him, which was his way of saving people from feeling too looked after. My phone buzzed while I was rubber banding bundles for Caldwell Lane. Adrian. I let it ring twice before I answered. Good, she said. I need you to stop by Mom's house in Charleston before you come up. Her supplemental insurance card is in the buffet drawer in the hallway. She'll want the blue housecoat from the back of her bedroom door, and there's a plastic pharmacy bag with her medication list. Bring that too. Good morning to you too. This isn't the time, Nell. I leaned against the sorting case and watched a temporary clerk wheel trays toward dispatch. Is there a time when it is? A clipped breath on the other end. I'm trying to make sure nothing gets missed. Her admitting team needs everything together. Do you ever hear yourself? I hear someone who understands how hospitals work. No, I said. You hear someone assigning errands. Silence, brief and chilled. Then she moved right past it. Mom's Medicare card should be clipped behind the blue folder. If you don't see it there, check the kitchen drawer by the phone. Not once did she ask if I was all right. Not once did she ask if I was scared to go through donor screening. To Adrian, I was not a daughter in this situation. I was reliable transportation with a pulse. When she said blue housecoat, I was back in her SUV from last spring, driving Dorothy to Charleston Gastroenterology for a colonoscopy, because Adrian had called the night before and said she couldn't possibly reschedule clinic. Mom had sat beside me in oversized sunglasses and spent the whole drive talking about a panel Adrian had been invited to in Raleigh. They're flying her in, she'd said, smoothing the hem of her coat. Cardiology and women's outcomes. Isn't that wonderful? I had taken my hand off the wheel long enough to adjust the air vent away from her. You okay with the prep, Mom? It was miserable, she'd said. Then, without even pausing, Adrian says the keynote speaker trained at Duke. By the time I finished at the post office and got home to pack, the memory had curdled into something familiar. I opened my bedroom drawer to grab a clean sweatshirt and saw my retirement clock still in its box on the shelf. The brass plate read, Elinor Kincaid, 32 years of service. USPS had gotten my full name right. They had clapped for me in the break room with sheep cake and grocery store flowers, and more sincerity than I'd gotten from my own mother in years. That afternoon, Dorothy had not called to say she was proud of me. She had called to say the Charleston Gazette had run a feature on Adrian's hospital system expansion, and wasn't it exciting that one of her daughters was connected to something so important? I shut the drawer harder than I meant to. By noon, word had leaked through town the way word always does in West Virginia. June Bell called just as I was putting an overnight bag in the trunk. Honey, I heard your mama took a bad turn. That she did. You need anything? Not yet. A pause, then her voice softened. Don't let anybody make you forget they say your name right out here. I closed my eyes for a second. Mrs. Bell had lived on my route for 20 years. Her prescriptions, garden catalogs, church envelopes, Christmas cards, all of it had passed through my hands. She knew exactly what she was saying without saying too much. Thank you, June. You bring yourself back home in one piece, she said, and hung up. 10 minutes later, my cousin Tobin called, proving the universe has no sense of pacing. He launched in without much preamble. Heard about Aunt Dorothy. Tough break. Good thing you're flexible, though. Adrian's life is so complicated. Somebody's got to handle the practical stuff. I stood with my car door open, staring at the maple tree in my front yard. That somebody always seems to be me, I said. Well, you know what I mean. I did know what he meant. The whole family always had. Adrian was the one they displayed. I was the one they deployed. By the time I reached Charleston, the light had shifted to that thin, gray afternoon that makes every house look a little lonelier than it really is. I still had a key. Dorothy had never taken it back. Maybe because she trusted me, maybe because she forgot I might one day use it for something other than helping. The house smelled like lemon polish and that lavender room spray she bought in bulk from the church craft fair. Bulletins were stacked on the kitchen counter under a ceramic rooster. A lace runner sat centered on the hallway console like it had been measured there with a ruler. And everywhere I looked, Adrian stared back at me from silver frames and brushed brass. Medical school, white coat, wedding dress, Christmas morning with her sons. Adrian at a podium, Adrian in pearls, Adrian holding Mom's shoulder outside some hospital fundraiser. I found the blue housecoat exactly where my sister said it would be, hanging behind Dorothy's bedroom door. The pharmacy bag was in the bathroom cabinet. The insurance folder took longer. I crouched at the buffet in the hallway and pulled out a drawer full of old receipts, church pledge cards, and folded paper menus from restaurants that had been closed for years. Something slid free from beneath a stack of yellowed envelopes and landed against my knee. It was a photograph. Small, square-cornered, glossy with age. Me, at maybe 9 years old, standing beside my father by the old wooden mailbox at the end of Birch Street. He had one hand resting on top of it, and I was grinning into the sun like I believed the whole world might turn out to be kind. My father looked down at me instead of the camera. That was the first thing I noticed. He was looking at me. The photo had been kept flat, protected, not forgotten, hidden. My phone rang in my hand before I even stood up. Dorothy, did you get the housecoat? I looked around the hallway lined with evidence of one daughter and absence of the other. Yes. And the diuretic list? Adrian said you're better at keeping track of paperwork than she is. Of course I am. She missed the edge in my voice, or chose to. Make sure you bring the blue folder too. The doctors in Pittsburgh ask for everything twice. Mom, what? I waited absurdly for her to ask me if I'd eaten, if I was tired, if I was afraid. Nothing came. Just be careful on the turnpike, she said. Then the line clicked dead. Cal was waiting outside in my driveway when I got back to the car. He had followed in his own truck after dropping off feed at his brother's place outside White Sulphur. He looked at the photo in my hand and then at my face. You find what you needed? I slid into the passenger seat of my own life for one unsteady second and held the photograph by its corners. She didn't forget me, I said. She just didn't want anyone else to see me. Cal nodded, like that made perfect, terrible sense. We were halfway out of Charleston when Naomi called to confirm my workup schedule in Pittsburgh. Labs, imaging, medical consult, psychosocial evaluation. Her voice stayed measured as she explained that if the donor team believed I was acting under pressure or stepping in only because other family members had stepped away, the process could be paused. That would not be a punishment, she said. It would be protection. By the time the call ended, the city lights were behind us, and the highway had started to rise into black hills. I laid the photograph on my lap and watched the guardrails catch the headlights in silver flashes. The woman in Pittsburgh was not forgetting me. She was waiting for the daughter she had spent years keeping out of sight. And by morning, I was going to be in the one place left where she might finally have to look at me without a frame around somebody else. By 7 the next morning, I was standing in donor services at UPMC Presbyterian with a plastic bracelet on my wrist and a clipboard in my hands, filling out forms that asked me if I understood, in clear legal language, that no one could make this decision for me. The waiting area was bright in that overly clean hospital way. Pale floors, gray chairs, a coffee machine no one really trusted. A television on the wall was tuned to a morning show with the sound off. Every few minutes, a name got called, a door opened, a door closed, and someone's life moved into another room. A woman in navy scrubs came out and called Elinor Kincaid. That was the first time in 2 days I'd heard my full name spoken without hesitation. She introduced herself as Paige Hollowell and walked me into a small consultation room with a round table, 2 chairs, and a box of tissues that made the whole thing feel more serious than the forms had. She explained that she was the independent donor advocate, not part of my mother's medical team, and not there for my family's comfort. If you want to stop this process at any point, she said, you can. If you want more time, you can ask for it. If you want to speak without your mother or sister knowing what you said, that stays with us, unless there's a safety concern. I looked at her for a second. So this isn't about what's easiest for everyone else? A little smile crossed her face. No, this is about what's right for you. Nobody in my family had ever framed anything that way. The morning blurred into blood pressure cuffs, a chest x-ray, lab tubes lined up in a tray, an EKG with cold stickers on my skin, and a technician explaining where to leave my urine sample like this was just another Tuesday. I moved from room to room carrying a paper schedule that had my name printed on top, and each time someone checked it, they looked at me like I was the person the day belonged to. Around noon, Naomi Keller met me outside imaging and asked if I felt up to seeing my mother between appointments. That depends, I said. Is she up for seeing me, or is she waiting for Adrian? Naomi did not pretend not to understand. She's had a long morning. So have I. That earned me the faintest nod. Room 614. My mother looked smaller than she had in Charleston. Not just 6 smaller, but diminished, as if the hospital bed had taken away the parts of her that had always seemed too large for the room. Her hair was flatter, thinner, her skin had a gray cast under the fluorescent light, and her hands were bruised along the veins from IVs and blood draws. There was a glass vase on the windowsill with a bouquet of white lilies. A cream card tucked into the plastic wrap had a single letter on it, A. Dorothy brightened the moment she saw me, and for half a second, some foolish part of me thought maybe this was the day she'd say my name first. Instead, she said, Adrian called my nephrologist this morning. She wants another opinion on the dialysis schedule. I set my bag on the chair. Good afternoon to you too, Mom. She either missed that or chose not to hear it. Those flowers came from a place in Charlotte she likes, very expensive. She's always had such good taste. I looked at the lilies, then at her. I drove 4 hours, and all she could talk about was a florist. I brought your medication list and the blue housecoat. Oh, good. Put the folder in the drawer. The housecoat can go on the hook. A nurse came in before I answered. Erin Colfax, according to her badge. She moved with the kind of efficient gentleness hospital nurses seem to learn as a second language. She checked my mother's IV line, scanned a wristband, then glanced over at me. Family? Before I could answer, my mother said, This is my daughter. Erin smiled. And which daughter is the donor candidate? My mother paused. It was brief, maybe no more than a second, but I felt it like a hand on my throat. I'm the donor candidate, I said. Erin looked from me to the lilies and back again, then nodded once and kept working. No judgment, no theater, just the faint shift in the air that happens when an outsider quietly notices something isn't matching the story. After she left, I pulled the chair closer to the bed. Mom, when were you going to tell me? Dorothy frowned. Adrian said the hospital had to contact family in a certain order. That wasn't the question. She looked at the flowers again, as if they might help her. Everything moved so quickly. No, I said. Everything moved around me. She pressed her lips together and smoothed the edge of her blanket. I'm tired, Nell. I almost laughed at the irony. She used my name only when she needed the conversation to soften. Later that afternoon, Naomi asked me to step into a conference room down the hall. Paige was already there with a yellow legal pad on the table. Naomi folded her hands. I need to be very direct. Tomorrow's evaluation is not a formality.
If our team believes you are doing this under family pressure or stepping in because other people stepped away without being honest about it, we can pause the process until we are certain this is fully voluntary. Pause it how long? As long as needed. I looked at the carpet for a second, then back at both of them. So if the truth in that room is ugly enough, my mother waits? Paige answered this time. If the truth in that room suggests you are not being treated as a voluntary donor, then yes, our job is to protect you too. Protect you too. No one in my family had ever added that last word.
Adrian arrived just before 5, carrying an expensive coffee and a laptop bag like she'd stepped out of a conference and into a family crisis by sheer generosity. In my mother's room, she was soft-voiced and practiced. She adjusted a pillow, touched Dorothy's wrist, asked about creatinine and fluid intake, all with the authority of someone who knew exactly how to sound loving in front of an audience. Then she caught me in the hallway outside the elevators. "You look exhausted," she said. "Maybe that's part of why this is feeling bigger than it needs to." Bigger than it needs to? She lowered her voice. "You shouldn't do this if you're trying to prove something." I stared at her. Prove what? That you're the better daughter, that mom was wrong, whatever version of this you've built in your head. I did not raise my voice. I did not step closer. I just asked 3 questions. When did you know? She crossed her arms. When did they ask you to test? Her jaw shifted. Why did I find out last? She looked past me toward the elevators where a volunteer in a red vest was pushing an empty wheelchair. "I never refused," she said, finally. "I just didn't move forward. My schedule is not yours, Nell. My liability isn't yours either." So they did ask you first. I was the most obvious first call. And when you didn't move, they came to me. Her silence was answer enough. Back in my mother's room, Dorothy asked if I could call the church office in Charleston and let them know she would miss the women's circle luncheon next week. Then she asked if I could text the plumber because there was a slow drip under the kitchen sink, and she didn't want it getting worse while she was gone. Even then, with donor paperwork in my tote bag and a bandage still on my arm from blood work, I was still the daughter assigned the practical things. Cal called while I was downstairs getting coffee I didn't really want. "How's Pittsburgh?" "Full of people with clipboards." "That means they're writing it down." I leaned against a vending machine and watched 2 orderlies wheel a bed through the lobby. Adrian was asked first. I figured as much. She didn't say no, she just stepped aside and let the whole thing roll downhill. "That's still a kind of no," Cal said. "Folks always think you'll stay where they left you, until one day your being there starts costing something." Naomi caught me near the elevators an hour later and reminded me to eat something light, sleep if I could, and come prepared to answer everything honestly in the morning. No polished version, no family version, just yours. By the time I got to the hotel room the hospital had arranged for donor candidates, the sky over Pittsburgh had gone dark and glassy. I stood by the window with the old photograph of me and my father in my hand and looked down at the city lights crossing the rivers. What was coming was not an argument, not really. It was a room my mother had never walked into before, one where the story she always told about our family might finally fail to carry her all the way out. I slept badly and woke before the alarm. The hotel room still dark except for the red numbers on the clock and the thin light under the bathroom door. By 8:30, I was back at the hospital with a paper cup of coffee I barely touched, and my father's photograph folded inside my tote, like something I needed to keep close. Not because anyone had asked for proof, but because I wanted one thing in that building that had always seen me clearly. Paige Hollowell met me first in a smaller consultation room off donor services. Naomi Keller joined a minute later with a file tucked under her arm and reading glasses pushed up into her hair. No one tried to warm up the room with jokes. No one pretended this was casual. Paige sat with her hands folded on the table. "Today is about clarity. If you need a break, say so. If you want me to stop the conversation, I will." Naomi looked at me over the file. I'm going to ask the same question in several ways. That's not because I doubt you, it's because I need to be sure you've had room to tell the truth. I nodded. She began simply, "Tell me about your mother." I could have spent an hour on that question and still missed the center of it. Instead, I said the thing that had followed me my whole life. She trusts me more than she values me. Neither woman interrupted. I told them my mother had always seen me as reliable, useful, steady. The daughter who would drive the car, carry the bag, fill out the form, answer the late call, show up when other people had reasons not to. I told them that in her house there were framed reminders of Adrian in every season of her life, and none of me. I told them my mother never forgot practical details about me, my route, my schedule, my usefulness, but somehow never remembered to tell people who I was in a way that made me sound like someone she was proud to claim. Naomi asked if I was angry. Of course I'm angry, I said, but I'm not here to trade one wound for another. I'm here because if I walk away without being sure this was my choice, I'll carry that too. Paige leaned in slightly. If nothing changes after today, if your mother never becomes the person you wanted her to be, do you still want to move forward? Yes. Why? Because I don't want the rest of my life built around a silence I chose on purpose, but I also can't do this one more time as some shadow in the room. If I go through with it, I go through with it as her daughter, not as the extra pair of hands she called when everything else failed. Naomi wrote something down, then looked back up. That's clear enough for me. Dorothy came in 20 minutes later in a wheelchair pushed by an aide, who left as soon as she had her positioned at the table. My mother had put on lipstick, pale pink, carefully drawn. Her hair had been brushed back. Even sick, she was trying to arrive in the room the way she wanted to be seen. Adrienne did not come in with her. That was deliberate. Naomi had made it clear she wanted this part with just the two of us and the donor team. Dorothy folded her hands in her lap and glanced around, like she expected a luncheon committee and not a reckoning. Naomi smiled politely and introduced herself again. "Mrs. Kincaid, I'd like to start with a simple question. Tell me about your daughter, Elinor." My mother looked at me, then away from me, then back to Naomi. "Nell has always been a good girl, very steady. She's worked for the post office for years. She's independent. She never caused us trouble." The words hit the table and lay there, thin and flat. Naomi did not rescue her. "When was the last time you called Elinor just to speak with her as your daughter?" Dorothy shifted in the chair. "Well, we've all been busy. Adrienne has the hospital, and Nell has her route, and I've had the house to manage, and then my health, of course." "That wasn't the question," Naomi said gently. My mother pressed her lips together. Naomi asked the next one without changing tone. "What photographs of Elinor are displayed in your home?" Dorothy blinked. "I have family pictures." "Which ones of Elinor?" A beat passed, then another. I heard the soft buzz of the overhead vent, the cart rolling somewhere in the hall, a cough from another room through the wall. It all sounded far away. Dorothy tried to straighten. "There are boxes, old things. We've moved things around over the years." I spoke before I planned to. "Mom, when did you last call me first?" The room went completely still. My mother turned her head toward me. I watched her search, not for a memory, but for a bridge, something soft enough to cross on, something she could say that would make the question smaller. Nothing came. Naomi let the silence hold, then she asked one more. "If you had to introduce Elinor to someone without mentioning her job, what would you say about her?" Dorothy's fingers tightened over each other in her lap. "She's dependable," she said at last. "She always comes through." That was it. Not kind, not brave, not funny, not loyal, not the one who remembers birthdays or keeps casseroles warm or knows how to calm a frightened child. Just Dependable. A feature, a function, a structural beam in a house nobody notices until it cracks. Naomi closed the file for a second and rested her hand on top of it. I need to clarify something for the record. In our standard donor sequence, Dr. Adrienne Vale was contacted before Elinor because she is immediate family and local to the medical decision-making. She participated in the initial conversation, received information about the first stage of donor evaluation, and chose not to proceed to screening at that time. My mother looked up sharply. Adrienne didn't refuse. Naomi stayed calm. I didn't say she refused. I said she did not proceed. Dorothy's eyes moved to me then, really moved, and for the first time there was no performance in them, just confusion and something like fear. I kept my voice level. Flowers don't get anyone through an operating room. No one corrected me. No one filled the space after. My mother looked older in that moment than she had in the hospital bed. Not weaker, just stripped of all the little stories that had always helped her keep the room arranged the way she liked it. Naomi turned back to me. After everything we've discussed, do you still wish to continue as a voluntary donor? Yes. You understand that answer does not obligate you beyond today. I do. And this is your decision. It is. She nodded once, satisfied, and opened the file again. Then the room changed in a way I felt more than saw. Not because anyone apologized. No one did. Not because anything had been healed. Nothing had. But because the facts were no longer scattered around our family in separate versions. They were sitting there, in one place, written down in sentences no one could rearrange later. A nurse came in with a packet for pre-op confirmations and a yellow highlighter clipped to the front. She apologized for the interruption and handed a page to my mother. Mrs. Kincaid, I just need you to verify your emergency contact and post-surgical family contact. Dorothy took the pen. Her hand trembled slightly from the dialysis and the weakness, and maybe from something else. She looked down at the line, then up at me. Elinor Kincaid, she said. Not Nell, not my other daughter, not the one from the post office. My whole name, spoken clearly in a room of strangers, like it had always belonged there. The nurse wrote it down and moved on to the next form. When I stepped back into the hallway afterward, I didn't feel lighter. I didn't feel forgiven or vindicated or anything neat enough to fit in a sentence. I just felt exposed to clean air after spending years underground. The truth had finally stood up in full light, and no one in that room had managed to talk it back into the shadows. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was how cold the room felt. Not the kind of cold that comes from weather, but the dry hospital kind that settles into your mouth and behind your eyes. My lips felt cracked. My left side throbbed in a deep, dull way that told me exactly where the price had been taken. The ceiling above me was a flat white blur until it came into focus, panel by panel, and then I heard the low hiss of the vent and the soft machine sounds near the bed. Cal was asleep in a plastic chair by the window, with his chin dropped to his chest, his coat half on the floor. He had one hand curled around an empty coffee cup like he had meant to stay awake and lost the fight somewhere around dawn. I shifted, regretted it instantly, and closed my eyes again. A nurse came in a minute later, checked the monitor clipped to my finger, adjusted the blanket, and asked me how my pain was on a scale from 1 to 10. I gave her a number that sounded honest enough. She nodded, wrote something down, then reached into the pocket of her scrub top and handed me a folded piece of paper. Your mother asked me to bring you this when you were awake enough to read it. Her handwriting looked older than I remembered, thinner, less sure. The message itself was only 4 words. Thank you, Nell. Mom. I read it twice. It should not have mattered as much as it did. A thank you did not rewrite 30 years of being introduced like an afterthought. It did not fill in the empty spaces on walls where my face had never been. It did not return every drive to Charleston, every holiday, every phone call that somehow found room for Adrian's achievements, but not my life. But she had written my name.
Not daughter, not sweetheart, not that practical little half-title she used when someone needed something done. Nell, small and uneven and real. Cal woke up when I set the note on the blanket. "You look awful," he said. "That must mean I'm alive." That got the corner of his mouth to move. He stood, picked his coat up off the floor, and peered at the note without asking to see it. Well, well, I said. He nodded once. About time. Adrian came later that afternoon, just before dinner trays. She had changed out of whatever she wore to work into a camel coat and polished flats, but she still carried herself like she was walking through a hospital she understood better than the rest of us. She stood at the end of the bed and looked at the IV line, the monitor, the chart clipped by the door. "How are they managing your pain?" That was the first thing out of her mouth. Not, "How are you?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not even, "Are you angry enough to stop speaking to me forever?" "They're managing it," I said. She set her purse in the chair Cal had vacated and folded her hands together. "You look better than I expected." I smiled without warmth. "That's a lovely thing to say to the person who just got cut open for your mother."
Adrian flinched, just barely. For a second, the careful finish on her expression cracked. "I knew from the beginning I wasn't going to do it," she said. "I knew that. I just kept telling myself there would be another option before it ever got this far." "Before it got this far? You mean before it got to me?" She looked away first. "I told myself it would be handled, that the team would find somebody, that Mom would stabilize, that if I waited long enough I wouldn't have to be the one to say no out loud." There it was, not cruelty, not even denial anymore, just cowardice dressed in expensive language. "You were always the daughter Mom was proud to talk about. I was the one she counted on when it cost something." Adrian's eyes came back to mine, and for once, she had nothing polished enough to hide behind. She left a few minutes later without asking me to make her feel better. That by itself felt new. I was discharged 2 days after that with instructions, prescriptions, a pillow to brace against my side in the car, and a list of restrictions longer than anything I had been given at the post office in 32 years. Cal drove us back to Lewisburg with both hands on the wheel and the radio low. Every bump in the road found the incision. Every mile home felt earned. June Bell was on my porch before I had both feet on the steps. She held a casserole dish wrapped in a faded towel and looked me over like she was inspecting storm damage. "You sit down before you fall down," she said. "The rest of us can stand around and feel useful." Judah Keene showed up 10 minutes later with a stack of cards from the post office tied together with a rubber band, and a grocery sack full of soup containers someone had labeled with masking tape. He set everything on the counter and glanced around my kitchen. "You need anything else?" A month of uninterrupted sleep. "Can't help you there." Nobody made a speech, nobody turned me into a hero. They just moved through my house the way decent people do when they know what to do with love and don't need to say the word out loud. June put the casserole in the fridge. Judah took my trash out without asking. Someone I never even saw had mowed the strip along the fence by evening. And every one of them called me Nell. A week later, Dorothy called on a Sunday morning. Her voice was stronger than it had been in Pittsburgh, though still thinner than before. She asked if I was eating enough protein, then left a long silence after I said yes. "I'm doing physical therapy in the hallway twice a day," she said. "That's good." Another silence. Then she said, "Adrian thinks I should watch my sodium more closely." There it was, the old road, the old habit of circling every conversation back through my sister. Then I heard her stop herself. "Nell," she said, more carefully this time, "how is your side?" "Healing." The calls continued after that. Some lasted 3 minutes, some lasted 10. Sometimes she started to say, "that girl," or "your sister," and corrected herself. Sometimes she sounded like a woman trying to learn a language she should have spoken all along. One Sunday she slipped and said, "You've always been the easier one." I held the phone away from my ear for a second, then brought it back. "Mom, you may need time to get used to this, But if you keep talking about me like I am the extra piece of this family, I will hang up. I gave you a kidney. I am not giving you my name, too." She did not argue. She just breathed once, shakily, and said, "I understand." Near the end of October, when I could drive short distances without feeling every turn in my side, I took the old photograph to Charleston. Dorothy opened the door herself. She was slower than before, smaller in the shoulders, but she was standing. That mattered. I set the photograph on the hallway table between us. "I found this in your buffet drawer," I said, "under old church papers and takeout menus." She picked it up with both hands. For a long second, she only looked at it. "Your father loved that picture." "I know." I waited until she looked at me. "I don't need to be in the center of the room, Mom, but I'm not staying in a drawer anymore." She did not defend herself. She did not say, "I never meant it that way." She only nodded and stepped aside. We put the photo on the lower shelf in the living room beside the others, not higher than Adrian, not in the place of honor, but out where anyone could see it. A few Sundays later, Cal drove over around supper with a pot of soup balanced on one hand and his truck still running in the driveway. Dorothy had come up from Charleston that afternoon because her follow-up appointment at the clinic in Lewisburg was the next morning, and for the first time in my life, she was in my kitchen as my guest and not the other way around. Cal set the pot down and looked between us. "Smells better in here than at my house." Dorothy gave a faint smile. "That's because my daughter can actually cook." My daughter. Not the one from the post office, not the other one, not the dependable one, just my daughter. I looked past her then, toward the shelf where the photograph of me and my father sat beside the retirement clock and the folded note from Pittsburgh. Nothing in that room erased what had come before. My mother was not remade by surgery. My sister had not become brave simply because the truth had caught up with her. But the story had shifted in one place that mattered. From now on, if anyone wanted me in their life, they would have to call me by the name I had carried all along. If you've ever been the person who always showed up and still felt unseen, ask yourself what would matter more to you in the end, an apology or one honest moment where someone finally says your name like they mean it. If this story stayed with you, tell me where it hit you. And stay close, there are more stories waiting here.